I'm breeder Morgan Jacoby from Silverthorne Boerboels, and I'm here today to discuss, as a breeder, I think it's a worthwhile discussion about excessives, breeding for excessives, and how that affects the breed as a whole, and how that alters the look of our dogs over time. You know, we hear a lot about that in AKC. I think that's the most common critique about AKC, is how sometimes we lend to style and what's winning, and we start losing that breed type and breed standard, quality dog. And there are consequences to that. And so today I want to discuss that, because sometimes we look at our breed and we look at boerboels who tend to lack angulation, or, that tend to have, rears that are up in the air, or dogs that are too moderate, or depending on what kind of breeder we are, what our breeding goals are. We look at this and sometimes we tend to overcompensate. And one of the greatest places we see this, is when we look at straight rears. Back in 2015, that was kind of what we saw out more, 2010, 2015. It tended to be a dog that kind of sloped a little bit in the top line and was high in the rear, lacking a lot of angulation, really straight stifle. And so over the years, a lot of really, smart breeders have gone, hey, we need to change that. We need to add more angulation. And so we've seen kind of a trend of fixing this in some beautiful hind assemblies with great angulation. And then sometimes we see some sickle hawk and overangulation and too much length, from hip to stifle and stifle to hip, or stifle to hock. And so this affects the soundness of the dog, but it also affects the overall look. So we're kind of changing this breed, and we need to be very careful as breeders how we evaluate what we produce, because it does affect the quality of life of that dog. And that's how important conformation is, and how important our breed standard is that it's so reflective on what's going to make a functional boerboel. Now, if your front end is that bad, your pasterns are that long and the dog is paddling, and there are inaccuracies in that. And listen, every breeder can say, we get a wide range of what we produce, and then we make decisions based on that. And, that's where it really kind of shows as a breeder, what are your goals? Are you trying to make a paycheck, or are you trying to fix and better the breed? And I think most of us can sit there in our heart very passionately and say, we really do strive. We love our dogs, and we do strive to make better dogs. But there are consequences sometimes of going too much in an excessive. We see this with some people that want to say there's a working type of boerboel. Guys, there's one standard. And so where we deviate from, what our goals are, some of y'all might do protection work, or some of us may do dock diving, or some of us may do scent work, variety tracking, conformation. And so we all can basically identify and say, hey, certain body types and styles and certain temperaments do lend to a better performance dog versus conformation, etc. But where, as breeders, are we all, despite our goals, going back to that breed standard, back to South Africa and what the purpose of that dog is, what made it functional, and how are we check and balancing our breeding program? I don't know if I'm making my point well enough, that when we go into excessives, whether it's working style, and I'm not picking on anything or anyone in particular, I just want to illustrate that if we breed too much towards a working type, we lose our breed type, right? We start looking more like a Rhodesian or a different breed. And yes, you may get your performance, but you've lost breed type. And so you have to kind of draw yourself back and go, how do I correct this so that I have my athleticism, I keep my soundness and longevity, or what have you, whatever your goals are. Same with angulation when we look at this, or extreme size. I know that's a very delicate topic as well as people breeding for a small size. I mean, we've got a flip of every coin in this breed, don't we? And breeders that defend each side of that. And I feel like we all kind of hold a puzzle piece there, but we also have to really evaluate and have the integrity to go, where do we take it too far? Where do we educate ourselves greater by going and seeing the diversity of what everybody likes in their breeding programs? Where do we learn from that? How do we reflect when we look at the skeleton, the basic skeleton of the dogs we produce, and look at those proportions and make sure it reflects throughout the dog. Now, what I'm saying is, if I've got a front with great angles, I should see that reflected in a hind with great angles, right? Ideally, that's the ideal. But if I'm looking at a dog that has pasterns that are too long, sometimes I look in that hind assembly and I can see it. Or I see a loin that's really long. We're seeing some dogs bred that have some very long loins. As somebody coming from horses and weight-bearing animals, performance animals, we understand that when the back is not built correctly and the shoulder into the croup, the loin, those are very important parts of our dog. And that lends to your tail set and the angles in your hind and how that dog, when we talk about proper movement and propulsion of hind and the front being even, that's where all these technicalities in conformation, if you take it to the rudimental part, you see how this dog moves soundly when you're going towards that breed standard and that balance overall. You must have that balance front and back, correct? You want that level top line. You don't want to see the rear and the end. If I look at a dog and I see a rear in the end, it's not the end of the world. That doesn't mean that dog might not be a specimen in the breed and worthy in your breeding program at all. Like, there's strength in it, and you make a choice as a breeder what you keep in your breeding program. But ultimately, we want to breed something that's sound, that's not suffering, for an excess, or one that's lost breed type, or one that's too small, or one that's so big that its legs aren't able to stay sound underneath it. There's a balance in all of it, and that's the art form of breeding. So thank you for listening. There's so much more I'd love diagram-wise, and, looking at movement. I think it's fascinating to look at the skeletal. As an ex-artist, everything was based on that basic structure, coming from horses as well, and then building the muscle and building that foundation of a proper animal that is going to stay sound and functional, and then putting the mass and the bulk and everything we want to see that's so impressive about our breed, on that, based on our breed standard, because that is our blueprint of everything. So I'd love to get into more of that and more of the excessives, but those are just some of the things I wanted to discuss, because we again see it all reflective with our breeding program in a coming and going, meaning, when we talk in conformation of down and back, when we see how clean the movement is, and then we see them from the side gate and we see how this functions, and side gate can be so impressive, so we can go, wow, that's a great side gate. But when we see that coming and going and we look at those little components and we balance it front and back, it tells you multitudes about whether that dog is correct or not and what you're building towards the future. And that's when you talk about complementing a mate and bringing in a dog to breed with your dog, you really want to understand what you're combining there. So if you're looking at an extremely short hock to foot and you're looking at longer angles in hock to stifle and stifle to hock, or stifle to hip, you know that you're going to need to find a male that has a very correct hind end and more, even angles in between those points, because otherwise you're going to start having unsoundness. They're not going to be sound. They're going to start having health problems, or you'll start seeing edema and swelling in joints. And you see that in the front as well, in pasterns and joints like that, splayed feet, different things like we talk about good feet. So anyway, back to the point, guys, and thank you again for listening. But if you have an interest in this and discussing these things, and, I always say, I don't want to be overly critical to any one dog. I want to look about it as a breeder and as a scientist and go, what would I breed that dog to correct this? What do I like about this dog? What do they bring to the table? Where and how long would it take to fix this component without getting in excess? So let's think about that going forward as breeders, especially as we talk about angulation. I'm a breeder that's always needed more bend of stifle. So you can kind of see from my standpoint where my faults were and where I had to kind of go, how do we fix this? How do we troubleshoot this? And then overangulation, things like that. There's a balance between all of that and how that affects the soundness of your dog. Thank you very much for listening. Please comment. Let me know if you liked it or not, what your thoughts are. And again, thank you for listening.